Welcome, everybody. Welcome to episode number 12 of the African History Club. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. I welcome all new patrons as well. So, episode 12, we look at the actual setup of the colonial regime in Africa. We dealt with the formal partition of Africa in the last episode, the Berlin Conference, November 1884 to February 1885, under the tutelage of Otto von Bismarck, the German Chancellor. Africa was formally partitioned among the European empires. So, the best way to understand colonization is to see it as part of a continuation of the process whereby Africa was integrated into the global system beginning in the 1500s. We discussed the era of enslavement. That was a form of integration of Africa in the global system. And then in the 18th and parts of the early 19th century, when enslavement was now standing in the way of the new system of production, factory production, it had become a hindrance to the expansion of capital. So now the transition was made to colonialism, another way of keeping Africa still at that dependent and peripheral level of its integration with the global economic system. So the first thing that was done, the most significant thing, was the displacement of Africans from their land. And overnight, it transferred wealth to Europeans. When Africans were ejected from their land, and the land was given to Europeans, or the land became the source of rich mining material to extract the resources from the mines to ship to Europe. So let's look at Kenya, for example. In Kenya, 4 million acres seized from Africans, given to Europeans, 1,000 Europeans. So some Europeans got anywhere from 100,000 acres of land to 300,000 acres at a penny per acre. And the previous owners of the land, the Africans, overnight, from people that possessed assets and wealth, overnight they were turned into a penurious condition. They now became with no source of income and livelihood, and had no choice but to work for the Europeans. They were now working on land which yesterday belonged to them, as employees of the people that seized the land from them. And in Kenya, it was a particularly fertile part of the country, which was then renamed the White Highlands, exclusively for Europeans. Some Kenyans tried to work on marginal land away from the land that had been seized from them, but the Europeans needed labor to work the land. So they introduced a system whereby Kenyan males would be compelled to work in the land. They introduced a cash taxation system, and anyone who did not pay tax would be locked up. And Kenyans who reached the age of 15, males, had to register so that the Europeans knew the available labor pool. It was called the Kipande system in Kenya, where young Kenyans were actually made to wear collars, sort of like dog tags, to identify that they had registered and had now become part of the labor pool. And in other countries where the production remained with Africans who still owned their land and they were not kicked out, in Ghana, for example, another British colony, as Kenya was, the farmers were exploited in a different way. So, for example, the farmers who produced cocoa, and at one time, it was called the Gold Coast at that time. It became one of the world's leading producers of cocoa. And for people that are not familiar, because normally in the Western countries we see them as the final product, cocoa is used to manufacture chocolate. And chocolate today is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It was always a huge industry, even in those days. So the farmers were exploited by being underpaid. So the private European companies that purchased, they had a monopoly control over purchasing the produce, the cocoa from the farmers, would pay the African farmers anywhere from only 10 to 15% of the world price of those commodities. So you can imagine how much surplus was being extracted, was being stolen. It gives you a level of understanding of the nature and the extent of the exploitation that the farmers had to endure. At one point, the farmers decided to withhold their produce to protest being so inadequately underpaid by the purchasing companies. So that happened around 1937. So how did the colonial power, Britain, react? The farmers were protesting being underpaid by companies such as the United Africa Company, Unilever. These are companies that became global dominating companies in that era. So the British set up something called the Produce Marketing Board. So it was an administrative entity controlled by the British government, and the same private British companies who were the purchasers now worked for as middlemen for the produce marketing boards. So they were never eliminated from the equation. They continued to make their profits by being the buying agents for the marketing boards now. So the farmers might have been paid a little slightly better, but they were still essentially extorted, but now by the marketing board set up by the British government, which would then sell the produce to the Ministry of Food in Britain, which in turn would sell it to manufacturers in Britain or to the United States, companies in the United States that also depended on cocoa to manufacture chocolate. They were not dealing with the farmers in the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast later became Ghana. But they were dealing with the colonial power. So even the profit that the British made by selling the produce to American companies, none of that went back to the producers in Ghana. And of course, many Africans did not want to grow what is called cash crops, because you can't eat cash crops. You can't really eat cocoa. You can't eat cotton, which was another primary commodity. In the French colonies, when they were trying to establish cotton growing, Africans were banned from other activities such as hunting, for example, because they knew that if Africans were allowed to hunt, They would remain independent outside that colonial structure economy. They would still be able to sustain themselves, feed themselves by hunting. So hunting was banned in some of the French colonies in order to compel Africans to grow cotton. Cotton was called the mother of poverty in Mozambique, which was a Portuguese colony. And why was this? Because when there was a crop failure, it meant the farmers would have no income. They would have no money to buy food, and they would end up starving. Because when you're so compelled to grow cotton at the expense of growing your own food to sustain yourself, you hope that with the little money that you make, you will at least be able to buy food to sustain yourself. So during a crop collapse, or during the global collapse of commodity prices, during the Great Depression, for example, when nobody was buying primary commodities, farmers, Africans starved in Mozambique and other African countries. And they were compelled to grow cotton. If they did not grow cotton, they were either whipped, just as in the enslavement regime, when Africans, enslaved Africans in the South, here in the United States, were subjected to the whip, the lashes, the same thing in Africa. Or they were jailed for up to 2 weeks if they refused to grow cotton. And that is why it was called the mother of poverty in Mozambique. In German East Africa, which later became Tanganyika, which is today Tanzania, Africans rebelled against the German colonial regime in 1905 when they were compelled to grow cotton at the expense of growing whatever other produce that they had traditionally been growing, including the foods that they're accustomed to consuming. The rebellion was brutally crushed between 1905 and 1907. Up to 300,000 Africans died when the Germans introduced a scorched earth operation and starved. Most of the people who died actually died of starvation. Most of them were not even the rebellions, people who were fighting in the rebellion, but civilians who ended up being starved by the Germans. The Germans really practiced their genocidal policies that they were later on to carry out in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. They practiced it in Africa because in another German colony, German Southwest Africa, which is today Namibia, around the same period as well, from 1904 to 1908, when the Herero, Herero, and the Nama people, Nama, also rebelled, the German military commanders and the governors literally exterminated the Herero, killing about 100,000 Herero, most of the Herero, and about 10,000 Nama people. They were pushed into the desert, where they were then forced to stay and starve to death. And some were put in concentration camps. And some were subjected to experimentation. Some were decapitated, and the heads were preserved. And just to add on a little bit to the Herero massacre, there's actually an ongoing case now, because in the last few years, the Herero and Nama got together with some international lawyers, and they filed for reparations against the German government. In fact, at one point, the case was being handled by a United States court. I think they were trying to negotiate some sort of settlement at some point. So that was the nature of the colonial regime. So when people talk about the colonial regime being set out to develop Africa, obviously they're totally ignorant of the atrocities that occurred during this colonial era. And one of the worst, of course, occurred in what was called the Belgian Congo. First, it was called the Congo Free State, when it was the personal property of the Belgian king Leopold from 1885 to 1908. Under Leopold's regimes, Africans who did not produce enough rubber or enough ivory, they did not meet their quota for their village. Some were exterminated, some were permanently maimed. So if you do some research and you look at the history, you'll see photographs of Africans holding up the severed limbs, hands of other Africans, or Africans with parts of their limbs gone, holding up their own limbs. So their hands were cut off, or feet were cut off, and this was meant to incentivize those who were not producing enough. It has been estimated that as many as 10 million Congolese might have been exterminated during Leopold's homicidal regime in the Congo. It was so horrific that he was condemned by fellow European colonialists who were also exploiting and committing crimes in Africa. But they felt Leopold had gone a bit too far. So what was the solution? The private entity that Leopold had called Congo Free State, was it liberated and given back to the Congolese to determine their own destiny? No. It was then made into a Belgian colony. So a colony was supposed to be better than Leopold's homicidal regime. Up to 10 million people estimated to have died during this era under Leopold. There's a book called King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, and that is one of the more well-known books about this African genocide under Leopold. Primarily, the colonial sphere, the periphery, then became a source of revenue for the respective colonial powers of the day. So Africans were helping develop the economies of these European colonialists by producing the surplus, by being exploited, by being underpaid. In the mines, Africans were underpaid, Europeans were paid up to 10 times more than the African mine workers, and the death rate was horrific in some of the mines in what was Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe. There were 20 deaths per week in those mines, mining the gold and diamond, then would then be shipped to Europe. The other mining power, of course, was South Africa, where some of the shafts were so deep, and in ordinary situations, they would not even be mined because they would be seen as uneconomical. But the Africans were so underpaid that the mining companies were still able to make profits. And there was mining in the Gold Coast as well of gold. So the surplus came from the mining as well as from the agricultural production. And then the second way in which Africans empowered and built up the economies of Europe was by becoming consumers of the manufacturing products coming out of Europe. So they were exclusive monopoly markets for each of the European powers. So, for example, the cotton produced in Mozambique was shipped to Portugal. It was turned into textiles and then brought back to Mozambique, where the Africans who made a bare living, barely able to subsist and survive, were then compelled to purchase the manufactured products coming from Portugal. And the same pattern and system was used in all the other European colonies in Africa as well. So those were the primary ways in which Europe was extracting surplus from Africa, and at the same time ensuring that African countries would not industrialize. And that is the best evidence and proof that there was no design or intention to develop Africa economically. And it makes sense logically. Why would capitalists want to create other potential competitors by industrializing Africa? Which is why, at the time most African countries started winning their independence in the 1960s, there was no industrialization. And that is why, up to date, no African country is substantially industrialized. Because nowadays, instead of the colonial governors that had ensured that Africa would not industrialize, today the system is reinforced and enforced by the World Bank and the IMF. These are the entities that make credit, capital available to African countries. And one of the conditions, which is not written down, but it is one of the conditions, is that African countries do not industrialize because they're told to focus on agriculture because they supposedly have comparative advantage in that, which in itself is nonsense because agriculture is subsidized in the United States, meaning the market, which is supposed to belong to Africans, you focus on agriculture and then export it to countries, the United States, so that the United States and the industrial countries can focus on industrial products, and then you trade. That's nonsense, because not only does the U.S. also produce manufacturers, the U.S. also subsidizes its agriculture, meaning it eats up the market that is supposedly to belong to developing parts of the world, including Africa. And the US and the industrial world still gets to sell their manufactured products to the developing world, including Africa. And that is why the status remains the way it is today. I want to also talk about one other element, which was a big feature of the colonial regime in Africa: the white supremacy promotion and racism. So you had segregation of living quarters, of the schools, of the healthcare system, where the best facilities would be reserved for Europeans, whether it was the healthcare, the hospitals, the schools, and Africans never attained high-level education as well. And that is why when countries such as Congo became independent, there may have been no more than 2 or 3 college graduates, people who had managed to get themselves out of the country in order to get some level of education. So you would have a whole cabinet of ministers, maybe with 3 people with college degrees. They were set up for failure way, way before they won independence. Now I want to talk about another way in which Africa came to the rescue of Europe. And that is when Africans were taken from the colonies to fight in Europe's world wars. So in World War I, for example, France took 200,000 Africans from its West African colonies to fight in Europe in World War I, a war that Africans had no issue in, and they did not even know what the war was about. They fought in Europe for the European colonial powers. And then when they returned, the ones who were lucky not to have been killed, some came back with wounds. When they returned to their countries, whether it was Mali, whether it was Senegal, they returned back to the same discrimination and the same exploitation, when supposedly they had fought for freedom. They had fought to preserve democracy in Europe. That was the hypocrisy. And the second time was during World War II, of course. Once again, hundreds of thousands of Africans taken to fight in World War II in Europe came back to the same discrimination, the same exploitation. But there was something slightly different with World War II. By that time, many Africans had started moving to the urban areas where they were either working in the mining facilities or they're working as low-level, clerical-level employees of the colonial regime, working as part of the police force, which was manned by Africans, commanded by Europeans, or the armed force, which was also manned by Africans, meaning they made up the manpower, and commanded by European officers. So they'd become relatively urbanized and were becoming aware of some of the changes that were occurring around the world and access to struggles that were beginning to occur in other parts of the world that were still being dominated by European imperialists as well. So this was slightly different from after World War I. So World War II was when Africans really started to raise their level of consciousness and nationalism. And there was one incident that really sparked the rise of nationalism in Africa. And that was the invasion of Ethiopia by fascist Italy under Mussolini. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1936, it really rallied Africans, at least the ones in urban areas across the continent, who were able to know about that news. And why was that? Because Ethiopia had been the only African country that had not been conquered and colonized, as we learned in episode 11, when Ethiopia fought and defeated invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa on March 1, 1896. And that was a source of great pride to Africans who were conscious and in the urban areas and were aware of that history. So they were enraged when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And that is really what sparked the sense of nationalism, not only in Africa. It was a Pan-African type of nationalism. Because even here in the United States, people of African ancestry were also enraged by the invasion of Ethiopia. In fact, in Harlem, there were organizations that were set up to recruit volunteers, African Americans, to go and fight on behalf of Ethiopia, to preserve its independence. Of course, the State Department would not allow African Americans to travel. Whereas, on the other hand, European Americans, including those of Italian ancestry, were also mobilizing funds and volunteers to go to Italy and to volunteer to go and fight with Mussolini's invading fascist army. So now we get to 1945, the end of World War II, when Africans come back. This time they're not settling to go back to their fifth-class status in their own country. So that now will set up episode number 13, when we discuss the rise of African nationalism as our next episode of this podcast, African History Club. So my recommendation today, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, General History of Africa, Volume 7, Africa Under Colonial Domination, 1880 to 1935, edited by Adu Boahen. ADU is the first name, and Boahen is Boahen. So in the next episode, in addition to discussing the rise of nationalism, we will also discuss other aspects of the colonial regime in other parts of Africa that we could not cover in today's episode. I thank you so much, especially the newly joined patrons. If you feel that you're learning interesting history, please spread the word and feel free to invite other patrons to join us in this journey. Thank you and see you next week.